Far beneath the surface of the Northeast Pacific lies an area of the ocean floor known as the Clarion-Clipperton Zone, or CCZ. For decades now, this vast region, as broad, by some accounts, as the continental United States, has exemplified the ostensible promise of seabed mining. Upon and within the CCZ's abyssal sediments reside some trillions of polymetallic nodules, potato-shaped lumps rich in cobalt, copper, nickel, and manganese. Those minerals are, at the time of writing, vital ingredients in the making of electric batteries, and this makes them precious commodities for societies committed to transitioning away from fossil fuels. During our era of climate emergency, the riches of the sea are taking novel, and perhaps unprecedentedly valuable, forms. In October 2022, a publicly traded Canadian mining enterprise called The Metals Company, or TMC, published a triumphant press release to its investor media portal. According to the announcement, a successful pilot collection run had seen TMC and its partners extract 14 tons of polymetallic nodules in just 1 hour from a stretch of the CCZ only 147 meters long. The run took place in a region called Nori D, a 74,830 square kilometer section of the CCZ contracted by the United Nations International Seabed Authority, or ISA, to Nauru Ocean Resources Incorporated, or NORI, a company owned by TMC and sponsored, under the terms of ISA regulations, by the Republic of Nauru. TMC's website touts its Nori D license area as the site of the biggest undeveloped nickel deposit on Earth. It's just Mother Nature's gift to us. So has Gerard Barron, TMC's chairman and CEO, characterized the metallic abundance of this planet's ocean floors. Gifts from Mother Nature, invaluable assets for pursuing and shoring up national energy independence, needed tools for drawing down atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions, the common heritage of mankind. Thus, a handful of the many and diverse ways the seabed's mineral treasures have been interpreted and defined. For those who oppose abyssal mining, the stakes involved are no less momentous. It's just not possible to collect nodules, contends the oceanographer Craig Smith, without annihilating one of the largest wilderness areas left in the world. Where prospectors see possibilities for profitable resource development, Smith observes some of the most pristine, biodiverse habitats on a planet where we already have a biodiversity crisis because of destruction on land. Economic, technological, geopolitical, and ecological issues are vividly present amidst these controversies. Less obvious, but no less important, are the ways the seabed, and the ways we understand, relate to, and value the seabed, are entangled with human cultures, philosophies, and histories. In certain respects, this may seem a counterintuitive claim. Homo sapiens is ill-equipped for life at the ocean floor, and what we so-called moderns do know of the benthos tends to be heavily mediated through other-than-human apparatuses of sensation. We argue, nonetheless, that the contested underwater seascapes of nodule mining evoke lengthy, complicated, and sometimes fraught involutions of language, imagination, belief, ideology, and power, and that to contend meaningfully with the abyssal problems of the present and the future, it will be necessary to confront these entanglements, comprehend their pasts, and describe their ramifying effects. To these ends, we recently convened Humanities at the Seabed, Cultures of the Ocean Floor, the first meeting of an international working group committed to generating a collaborative account of, and an agenda for, a critical seabed studies. Over 2 days, a group of 8 of us, 4 working on the literatures of various periods and regions, a geographer, a geologist concerned with ocean literacy, an artist, and a curator, met to contemplate seafloor realms. We began with a series of questions. What were the practices, texts, or questions that had led us to the seabed, and how were we trying to orient ourselves there by looking to other disciplines and thinkers? Were colleagues back in our home departments beginning to look at us sideways, as though we'd gone off the rails? Will S. Hilton opened an article in The Atlantic in 2020 by asserting, unless you were given to chronic anxiety or suffer from nihilistic despair, you probably haven't spent much time contemplating the bottom of the ocean. What, exactly, was wrong with us?
As it transpired, thinking about and with the seabed, while certainly evoking anxiety, not least due to the mining operation Killian's outlined, was also agreed to generate a range of other emotions, awe and curiosity not least among them. These were reactions for which in some cases our scholarly training had prepared us and for which we had recourse to a certain vocabulary, the terminology of the sublime, for example. Our disciplinary training had also primed us to ask certain questions of the seabed. If it is a territory or a place, then what kind of territory or place is it? What are the terms, resource, abyssal, alien, through which it is typically invoked? And what might these terms tell us about human attitudes towards and valuation of the bottom of the ocean? But there was also a distinct sense of coming up against the limits of disciplinary perspectives, of how, for example, even within the context of a disciplinary turn towards the oceans, what is sometimes called the Oceanic or Blue Humanities, focus tends to be on oceans as sites of liquidity and flow, not sedimentation and sessility. Interdisciplinarity has become such a buzzword in the academy that meaning and excitement can sometimes be drained from it. But in thinking about the seabed, we found we were continually coming up against fundamental questions that drew us out of our disciplinary training and vectors of approach. Scholars trained in the humanities tend, for example, to treat terms like nature and wilderness with suspicion, feeling obliged to point out that such ideas are culturally constructed and that they may reflect worldviews that are far from universal. But does it in this instance make sense to speak with Craig Smith of the deep seabed as a wilderness, or to consider it more natural than other realms? Some ocean scientists are sick to the back teeth of the journalistic cliché that claims we know more about the surface of the Moon, or even Mars, than about the deep seabed. This does, after all, rather undersell the astonishing discoveries of past decades, including in the 1970s the discovery of hydrothermal vents, the first evidence of life existing independent of light, and, being metal-rich, also now a target for mining operations. But such ocean scientists will also acknowledge that much remains to be learned not only about how benthic ecosystems operate, but about how they tie in with global ecosystems. What, if any, is the role of the humanities scholar in all this? Is it to recognize that sometimes appeals to nature and to the value of the wilderness have virtue after all, or at least to swallow professional pride and acknowledge that such appeals may serve a greater purpose we wish to support? Or is it to challenge such appeals by pointing, for example, to the long history of human interventions on the ocean floor, or even by suggesting that arguments framing benthic interventions as transgressive are appealing to understandings of oceanic deeps as forbidden, understandings that often have their origins in literary and religious texts, including Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus? Or is it to pull in the other direction, showing how corporate communications treating the seabed as a source of untold riches or a portal to utopian futures are equally implicated in forms of narrative stretching back centuries? A humanities at the seabed may find itself caught between trying to amplify and communicate important information, something that is perhaps especially valuable given the cultural invisibility for some of the benthos, and feeling the need to interrogate some of the narratives that sit behind that information. Practitioners may also find a familiar preoccupation of oceanic studies becoming unusually urgent. If the ocean's availability as metaphor can sometimes cause us to take our eyes off the sea as a material entity, hence Hester Blum's now famous mantra, "The sea is not a metaphor," then this process becomes especially troublesome when it comes to a site that is rarely lived by humans, and whose metaphorical resonances can become overpowering. It is not just that we still have so much to learn about the seabed and what we might have done to it and be about to do to it. It is that the ocean floor is, it seems, always already a metaphor for the unknown, the unfathomable. How do we harness these powerful associations without losing sight of the thing itself? And to come at the issue another way, How far are deep-sea puns, such as unfathomable, ornamental, even irritating? And how far do they do important work in demonstrating how much imaginative work is already buried in our language before we even start talking about the ocean floor?
There are also some more practical questions facing humanities scholars. What does the Seabed archive look like? Whose texts, with texts broadly conceived, are we analysing? And where, if at all, do questions of literary and aesthetic value come into this? Whose narratives, human or non-human, might be missing from it, and how might we build them out of the silences? Another question we addressed at this first meeting was what kinds of narratives we tended to associate with the seabed: utopian, tragic, redemptive. And indeed how far narrative itself was helpful in getting at a part of the biome whose vertical access might be thought to arrest rather than generate stories. Is the seabed better seen through less horizontal and linear means, perhaps through probing essays, meandering lyric poetry, or non-representational art, for example? In order to address these questions, should humanities scholars try to find ways to go to the seabed themselves? And that became one of the main meta-questions around which we circled, with arguments lining up on both sides. On the one hand, imperial adventurers always felt the need to go there and see it, bringing with them contamination and, whether blindly or intentionally, often damaging what they saw. These imperial narratives of discovery, along with naming, mapping, flag planting, settling, claiming, are of course to be avoided and critiqued, using in fact the tools of historicization and critical analysis honed in humanities disciplines. On the other hand, however, feminist principles of embodied and participatory methodologies highlight the importance of sensory experience and a two-way relationship between subject and object. Melody Dew makes the point that apprehending a coral reef by diving it provides an entirely different perspective to accessing it via Google Earth's Underwater Earth, the equivalent of Street View for the seafloor. The dry, horizontal, screen-based experience betrays a terrestrial bias, in Dew's words, that assumes that the same representational techniques apply to both land and sea, ignoring the three-dimensionality, pressure, and saturation of oceanic environments. Related debates are ongoing in marine science, which has largely shifted from developing manned submarines to making use of unmanned submersibles in its research. Yet science also actually relies on discoveries made on the swiftly increasing number of manned expeditions which are privately funded as part of what some are calling deep-sea tourism. The future of the seabed is uncertain, whether it will be destroyed before it is explored, whether it will become a popular tourist destination or remain largely in obscurity. Imagining seabed futurities, beyond only narratives of doom and gloom, requires that we diversify our starting points. We might turn to Afrofuturism, African futurism, and indigenous futurisms, just as these are being used to inform wider planetary futures that include hope as well as fear. We need to think about dried and ancient seabeds that form mountain ranges and invoke geological perspectives, as well as about future seabeds, those parts of the world likely to be submerged by rising seas. Questions about the temporalities of the seabed, as well as its ontologies, are important, as are questions of imagining versus imaging. Pivotal too are the digital and data-driven streams which dominate undersea representation. What are the affects of seabed futures? Dread, wonder, vertigo, etc. And how might we both mobilize and moderate them? Imagining the future of the seabed requires thinking about what research questions to pursue, but also about what methods are required for that pursuit. Approaching the inhuman undersea from the perspective of humanities is almost inescapably paradoxical, requiring creativity and collaboration. Rachel Carson once proposed marshalling anthropomorphism precisely to combat anthropocentrism in approaches to oceanic realms. Similarly, we could draw on critical anthropomorphism as a method alongside other kinds of multi-species approaches. Thinking through the seabed as a commons, what Estrida Naimanas calls a hydrocommons, we might aim to explore forms of communal writing, as we are in fact doing in this paper. Collaborative methods might also constitute a way to address the problems of gap-filled, newly emerging and transdisciplinary knowledge, in terms not only of research and writing, but also of teaching. So what might constitute future seabed pedagogies? Another way forward might maybe to develop a glossary of shared terms, growing a scholarly as well as publicly oriented seabed literacy. The hubris of all these terms, literacy, glossary, pedagogy, should be immediately apparent, though, against the fathomlessness of the deep. Key to any method in the seabed humanities, as really became apparent at our workshop, should therefore also always be humility and humour.
Last November, TMC disseminated another exultant communique, this one trumpeting the first integrated system test in the Clarion-Clipperton zone of the Pacific Ocean since the 1970s. This run, conducted over some 80 kilometers of the NORI-D area, was described in a press release as having achieved a sustained production rate of 86.4 tons, or about the mass of 40 Tesla Model S vehicles per hour. Commenting somewhat eccentrically on his company's achievement, Barron declaimed that we believe in making decisions based on data and evidence, not speculation and sentiment. A critical seabed humanities recognizes that however ostensibly objective, anthropic interventions in benthic realms are never unhaunted by human, and more than human, feelings, desires, imaginations, politics, and cultures. Our collaborative dedicates itself to characterizing these presences, to feeling their histories, and to anticipating their possible futures. Thank you.